Well, for more now on the latest U.S. travel restrictions on Cuba, let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in the studio is Colin Laverty. He's the president of Cuba Educational Travel, an organization that connects Americans and Cubans through travel. Also with us is Jim Bialik. He's the vice president of Engage Cuba, a coalition of private companies working to end the travel trade embargo on Cuba. From London, Cristina Escobar is a Cuban journalist and commentator, and Lester Munson is a principal at BGR Group, a leading government relations firm right here in Washington, D.C. And thank you to all of you for being with us. Cristina, let me start with you in London. Looking at these latest restrictions that the United States government has introduced, what kind of impact do you think it will have on Cubans?
Well, the biggest impact is essentially around the ecosystem of private business and taxi drivers that live out of these thousands of Americans arrived each week through the Havana port. When you think about in big numbers, last year Cuba received over 4 million tourists, only 800,000 through recreational vessels. So the number is not that big and the impact is not that big either. The kind of tourism that arrives in recreational vessels is not really a good tourism in the sense that they don't spend much. They stay over in the big boat. But definitely these kind of private enterprises, little restaurants that a lot of them were founded by entrepreneurs who wanted to take advantage of the opportunity of having these tourists over will be severely affected. Essentially in Havana, Cienfuegos, and Santiago de Cuba. The perception is not very nice either because you see these streets that were filled with American tourists who were spending money buying art craft, buying art, going to restaurants, going to drink a daiquiri or a mojito. In El Floridita, this is more empty than it used to be before, and in this sense affects, people are very mad in this regard because of this measure won't affect directly the Cuban government. The first people who will feel the heat of this is actually the private workers near these ports.
Yeah, that's what we just heard in our report as well. Colin, Americans have been able to travel to Cuba under what is known as the People-to-People program. Given these restrictions now in place, will there be other ways that Americans can go to Cuba?
Yeah, so the Trump administration eliminated the people-to-people category, which was the most common way that Americans were traveling to Cuba. I think we'll have to wait and see how the dust settles a bit to see how the industry reacts and also the average American traveler. But there still remain 11 other categories to travel to Cuba, and some of them are quite broad. You have professional research, professional meetings, which means you can go to a conference, you can organize a board meeting, a conference retreat. You have support for the Cuban people, which I think we'll see a lot of the folks that were traveling under the people-to-people category gravitate to support for the Cuban people, which essentially means you need to spend your time supporting independent Cubans, so entrepreneurs, cultural groups, religious entities. And so I think as folks kind of figure that out, you're going to see a lot of Americans traveling under that category. I think more than anything, unfortunately, this kind of causes a lot of confusion and a lot of fear. And that was what we were starting to get over with the Obama administration, where there was this, psychologically, it was normal for Americans to book a ticket, to book an Airbnb or in a hotel and go. And so we finally got to the point where Cuba was safe, was normal, was legal. And so this is another kind of attempt by the Trump administration to make it more confusing, fearful. And so we have to see, but I think a lot of work will be done, and there is a huge demand amongst Americans to travel. So we're not going to see a complete stop. We'll just see a slowdown temporarily.
You were there, Colin, when the Obama administration lifted a lot of the restrictions, tried to normalize relations. Did you see a change in the country or in a place like Havana?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was very concrete changes. I mean, we saw a private sector that went from less than 100,000 people to 500,000, and really kind of robust dynamism within that community of entrepreneurs. We saw connectivity in terms of telecommunications, cell phones, certainly the internet, more accessible, prices going down, faster speeds. And so really across the board, we saw a number of changes that, U.S. policy was unable to accomplish in 5 decades of of an embargo and kind of an isolation policy, we saw more progress in a year and a half, 2 years under the Obama administration when they fully normalized relations.
Right.
And I just add to that, more than anything, we saw optimism and energy amongst the Cuban people who see their future and kind of their livelihood directly connected to the relationship with the United States. And a lot of that wind has been taken out of the sails, unfortunately, with Cubans that decided they wanted to stay on the island, build their life there because things were changing, they were getting better. And what this administration has done repeatedly is kind of take that hope away from young Cubans.
Lester, given what we're hearing here and given what we heard in our report as well, is this a smart idea? What is the U.S. trying to achieve with this?
Well, I'll be the first one to say that U.S. economic sanctions on Cuba haven't been as effective as their advocates would like them to be. That's certainly true, and I'm generally in favor of freedom for Americans to do things they want to do. But I do think we need to be realistic about the role of the government in Havana here. It's in fact the Cuban government that restricts the actions of its citizens. They are responsible for limitations on the free market, for limitations on entrepreneurship. They're the ones who are generally benefiting from the increased capital flows to the island. So while I'm never really in favor of tightening economic sanctions unless it's for a very specific U.S. foreign policy purpose, frankly, I don't really see that these restrictions are making all that much of a difference on the ground. I disagree with some of the folks previously who have said that the Obama opening made a big difference in Cuba. I don't think that was true. We got no real policy reform from Havana. It's still a one-party
Yeah, but didn't
state.
it make a difference in terms of the numbers of people engaged in private enterprise in Cuba? We heard from 100,000 to 500,000.
Well,
Isn't that something
that
that
may be true. I'm not sure I believe Cuban government figures, to be honest with you. If it was a modest increase, I think that's good, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what really has to happen in Cuba.
Go ahead, Jim. You want to say something?
I think the point that there haven't been as big of changes over the past 50 years as folks would have hoped by putting the embargo in place is, I think, a point we can absolutely all agree on. The point where I would push back has to do with the structural changes we've seen within Cuba since the Obama opening. So not only have we seen large expansion of the private sector, but we have also seen there's a regular reformation process or change process for the Cuban constitution. And in that change, which has been largely formulated over the years where there has been a more liberalized trade policy between the US and Cuba, we have seen some institutional reforms coming into place, including changes to the way private ownership can work, moves towards expanding the role of small and medium-sized enterprise in the private sector, and just accommodating the growth of that private sector. So I would say it is not the overnight changes that maybe some people were expecting with the embargo 50 years ago, but there have been some structural reforms which are, it's the Cuban state accommodating this growth of the private sector. And I think that's very important to understand because our goal in creating an economic barrier around Cuba was to essentially starve the government and have the population that was interested in private enterprise rise up. And we're seeing that now through engagement. So we should be fostering that where possible.
So, Lester, there have been net benefits from engagement rather than isolation, haven't there?
I think there have been some, but they've been very modest. And I think we need to be realistic about the challenges that remain in Cuba. There's still not real rule of law. It's a one-party state. The government essentially controls all activity. There's not real, true internet access for anyone in Cuba. So while yes, I celebrate entrepreneurship in any form, and I think that's a good, we do need to keep it in perspective.
Yeah.
I wish the Obama reforms had resulted in a lot more change in Cuba.
Christina, you look very surprised when you were listening to Lester there.
Yes, I'm very surprised because, Cuba was the fastest growing market for Facebook in 2016. Cuba is not China. There's full internet. You can access, it's exactly the same internet you can have here in the UK or in the United States. It's not true that there's not a full internet. And my impression is that in a lot of occasions, the rhetoric from the United States comes from a point of view in which the changes or anything that has to happen in Cuba, it's up to the Americans or it's up to the United States. Whatever is happening in Cuba should be up to the Cubans and not from any perspective or any kind of pressure from any foreign government. Essentially, when this foreign government is bullying Cuba with such a complex and wide system of sanctions as it is the embargo or blockade. This is the main limitation for Cuban economy to actually grow normally internationally. And I do believe that the perspective should be on what's the main intention here. The intention is to suffocate the government, but the ways in which they're trying to pursue this is actually suffocating the common people on the ground, the real people who are, and create this effect of pressure cooker, which only affects the common Cubans. And this is why it's very confusing to believe that whatever happens needs to happen in Cuba. And this is a very interesting phase. I don't know what exactly needs to happen in Cuba. But whatever it happens needs to happen from the Cubans' perspective, not Americans' perspective.
Yeah, you're talking there, Cristina, about ordinary Cubans. Our reporter in Havana, he did talk to some ordinary Cubans on the streets there, some people who work in the tourist industry. This is what some of them had to say. Let's watch this.
When the cruise ships were coming, the whole country had life. There was a lot of tourism. They were riding in cars, carriages, using the city's buses. And there was more life. Now, no. Now everything is idle. Now there is no tourism. People come, but just a little.
The numbers are that we have lost 60% of sales. That's very hard. It has a strong impact, and we are already thinking about how we are going to deal with this crisis.
So, Cristina, you can hear that Cubans, some of them, are hurting from these restrictions. Can Cuba make up for these losses from American tourists, perhaps from tourists from other countries?
Well, as a matter of fact, the big numbers are from Canada, from Europe, from Russia. The big numbers in terms of tourism going to Cuba, essentially to big resorts in the beach, not so much like walking on the streets. The American tourism, and Colin knows this very well, the American tourism is a tourism interested in culture, in art, in history. They want to deal with the everyday, with the common Cubans. They don't want to stay in big hotel in the beach. They actually want to know a little bit deeper. So it's very hard to actually substitute an American tourist who tends to pay a lot of money, spend money, and are interested more in history and dealing practically exclusively with private business and restaurants. This provides and helps a local horizontal economy, which is going to be affected essentially in central urban port areas, as in Havana, as in Cienfuegos and Santiago de Cuba. Varadero, the biggest beach in Cuba, won't be affected by this. It's essentially the port areas in these big cities.
Okay. Colin, there certainly is interest among Americans who want to visit Cuba. There was figures put out by the U.S. Department of Transport which said that 893,000 Americans flew to Cuba in 2018. That's a significant increase from just 177,000 2 years earlier in 2016. What does that tell us?
I mean, there's incredible interest, there's incredible demand, and you have to look at those numbers. That was significant growth, and that was still with very serious restrictions in place. So if we look at a process of truly liberalizing travel to Cuba, where it's free to go there like anywhere else in the world, and most estimates show that we'll see 2-3 million Americans going each year. What that represents for the economy, what it represents for the private sector. And I just want to touch on one other point. I think we need to be realistic. I mean, we can debate how much happened under Obama. We can debate how much happened under the last 50 years of an embargo. When we look at what's happened, in the last couple of weeks and what happened in June of 2017, this is about Florida. This isn't about Cuba. This isn't about Castro. This isn't about an entrepreneur. This isn't about the average family. This is about winning votes in South Florida. And that's the only reason that we're even sitting here having this conversation right now.
Lester, is this what it's all about?
Well, one of the wonderful things about the United States is that we have a totally open political system, and people can lobby for things, and you're allowed to criticize your own government and petition your government for certain policies you want. And I think that's certainly happening on Cuba. But I would point out that the economic embargo on Cuba, which is largely a result of the Helms-Burton Law from about 20 years ago, was a bipartisan piece of legislation that passed both the House and the Senate, and the vast majority of those votes for that legislation were not of members of Congress from Florida. So while it's true Florida politics are important, it's not the only thing going on here. The U.S. as a free country is always going to be upset by the very restrictive government in Cuba. The U.S. does not want to bully the Cuban people. It may want to bully the Cuban government, frankly.
Go ahead, Jim.
would push back, and what I would say is, I don't think that the Trump administration is looking at whip counts from congressional votes 20 years ago. I think that they're exclusively looking a year into the future, and they know that they're not going to get back into the White House without Florida in their column. And there are so many other issues in Florida that are going to draw pockets of voters that generally aren't voting out to vote, and those are not in the Republican column. This is a very, very good wedge issue because it starts to bring voters onto the Trump administration side around the Cuba issue, and it largely distracts from the larger policy issues that are facing Florida, like affordable health care and gun control and environmental issues. This is a perfect wedge issue for this administration. So that makes me think that it has nothing really to do with an interest in reforming U.S.-Cuba policy or the embargo at all.
Wouldn't it be great if in Cuba there were a political party that were able to take advantage of the concerns of the entrepreneurs and they could ask for a change in their government that would actually result in a real opening to the United States? Unfortunately, that's not going to happen right now. That's the thing that would really solve this problem in Havana.
You can't vote in Cuba to repeal Helms-Burton. I mean, that's the challenge. I mean, this is the thing that
No, but you can end one-party rule. You can give people real political rights. You can allow the freedom of expression. You can allow them to criticize their own government, which they can't do right now. And if those things happened, Helms-Burton would disappear in a overnight.
And I would in response to that, I don't think there's anyone at this table or on this show that doesn't want more pluralism in the decision-making process, in the way that Cuba's run. I think we all share that belief. I think most people, almost unanimously, the folks that have traveled and spent time in Cuba, you can talk to folks from the Catholic Church, you can talk to folks from the human rights organizations, across the board feel that when the U.S. gets its finger out of the eye of Cuba, that creates space for dialogue, for debate, and for Cubans on the island like Christina, like entrepreneurs, and the thousands of others that want a more diverse political environment to push for that change. Our embargo does not help with that. And I would just, on one final point, we can debate whether we're being effective or not, but let's remember that President Trump sent his team to Cuba to look at resorts, to look at hotels, to invest, and on the brink of announcing, he hasn't said anything about these.
That was before he was president.
Before he was president. He hasn't said anything about these newer restrictions. He's also sold billions of dollars to governments with more repressive, with a more repressive record on human rights. He's visited or he's applauded other leaders who are criticized, much stronger than Cuba in terms of their shortages on freedoms of principle of human rights.
Right.
So let's not. I think we need to be fair, and if we're going to, compare apples, let's compare apples, and be realistic in terms of what we're actually looking at.
Christina, I want to look at something else, and that is a U.S. government announcement in April that Cuban Americans and U.S. businesses could sue companies which were using or had taken over property seized after the revolution in 1959. And when that announcement was made, this is how the Cuban foreign minister responded to it. Let's listen.
I call on the international community to stop this nonsense and irresponsibility. We must act before it is too late. This dangerous escalation must be stopped for the sake of the people of Cuba, the United States, the region, and the world.
So, Christina, how has the international community responded to that?
Well, actually, it's been a very coherent answer, and it's not the first time the European Union has answered very clearly. This affects the interests of companies in Cuba. Canadian government has said the same thing. They actually made a joint statement about this, and the idea is that express with a very, very clear perspective to the American government that this affects the interests of European and Canadian companies in Cuba who are investing. Just to give you an example, half of a lot of hotels are owned by Spanish companies, tourism companies who bypass the embargo, don't have a lot of presence in the United States, but for Cuba, and now some of these properties can be affected by these lawsuits. This is a very long and complicated debate. It has to do with nationalizations. A lot of people were paid after these nationalizations. American companies did not, Cuban Americans did not. But again, I think all of this is around a rhetoric very focused on South Florida, on the votes, as Colin said. It is not a thing that, and it will definitely affect Cuba. In which way? This affects the appetite for foreign investment to go to Cuba and invest. And again, if I would have the opportunity of, in a way, defending or argumenting for the people who defend the American interests in Cuba, all of these only prevent a political change in Cuba, political dialogue in Cuba, because when you're being affected or bullied by the biggest country of the world, the most powerful country of the world, then the normal reaction is to defend. Even if you're not with the government, you can go to Cuba, and please do go to Cuba, and you can talk to people on the streets, and even if they are against the government, even if they disagree with a lot of the policies in Cuba today, they do not like Trump's policies on Cuba, because those policies affect them. And this is why the supposed aim of the American government on Cuba is not being fulfilled by this path. It's been 50 years of demonstrating this. The Cuban government is so used to this kind of rhetoric and is very well trained for years or decades on doing this. The hard part was actually Obama, a respectful president that wanted to engage and wanted to help people in Cuba to move forward.
Jim, one other complication, shall we say, or dimension to all of this is the Trump administration has been trying to link this announcement about Cuba to what's going on in Venezuela. In that, have they succeeded in making that link?
I think that it has certainly been, they've become inextricably linked in the narrative that's been put out by the administration. Venezuela was one of Cuba's earliest independent trading partners after the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, there is a lot of history there. Similarly, it was one of the first major trading partners where Cuba was able to export what they have quite a bit of, which are professional or medical professionals, and import something they actually needed, which was oil. And so, I mean, there's a long, long history there. In addition, I think that there's a lot to be said about the fact that Cuba does have military and intelligence advisors in Venezuela. So, you know, yes, these countries are absolutely linked in this regard. Now, I think that it's a bit of a jump to get from what's going on in Venezuela and how we need to be managing socialism in the hemisphere to some of the Title III claims and linking what the administration is doing to what's actually happening in Venezuela with Cuban support. The Title III claims, if anything, it's, as we've seen from the number of suits that have come out, a relatively small number of people, even though there was a threat that it could be tens, if not hundreds of thousands of claims that were made. There have been a relatively few number of claims made. So this isn't this massive slap back.
And the Title III claims are what?
Title III claims are, right now there have been claims against the owner of the ports that are being used by cruise lines or were used by cruise lines, and in addition to that, against the Cuban petroleum entity as well. And so I would say that now Title III has been a really popular issue for Cuban Americans for a long time. And so linking, in the announcement that they made that Title III was going to affect, this is at the Bay of Pigs Veterans Society, and they're also announcing changes to remittances at the same time. That, again, takes it out of the policy realm and throws it right back into that political pool, and it creates confusion and it causes a lot of distrust to what our actually motives are here and whether they're grounded in the policy between the U.S.-Venezuela link or it's something else.
Lester, we could see policy on Cuba swing from one side to the other, depending on who's in the White House. But what are the chances of us seeing changes in the U.S. Congress? Because, part of that is legislation, the Helms-Burton Act, as you referred to.
One of the things that you can always count on Congress to do is defend democracy and human rights abroad, and that's a big part of the reason they support the economic embargo on Cuba, broadly speaking.
Not always, though, right?
No, I think you haven't really. There was an effort by the Obama administration to try to repeal parts of Helms-Burton.
Right.
That failed. They couldn't get a full ambassador through the U.S. Senate. even though they had this opening. And let me just point out that it was during the Obama opening to Cuba when suddenly dozens of American Foreign Service officers fell ill in Havana from mysterious reasons that have largely been laid at the feet of the Havana government. So while the Obama administration opened to the Cuban government responded effectively.
Didn't we
by
also
poisoning
find out
American
that the
diplomats.
noise they were hearing at the American embassy or the American representation, there was actually crickets, was insects?
I don't think we did. And I think there are real health issues that were a consequence of that.
Colin, I have to ask you about one more thing, and that is one other option that the United States is looking at, maybe unconventional, but there is a plan to encourage American owners of baseball clubs to hire players from Cuba on condition that Havana loosens ties with Venezuela. That's kind of baseball diplomacy here.
I think it's ridiculous. You know, to ask the Major League Baseball Association to do the work of the White House or the State Department is foolish. But, you know, I would say I agree with Secretary of State Pompeo a few weeks ago when he said we should talk to Cuba about Venezuela.
Okay. We're going to have to end it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.